consultatory process for the obtaining witnesses in his favor and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense.
Now I yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski.
Amendment 7. In suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law.
I now yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores.
Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted.
I now yield to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Walz.
The Ninth Amendment. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people.
Amendment 10. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the people respectively, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. I now yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Sickling.
The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state, or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state.
Now I yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Graves.
Amendment number 12. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president, one of whom, at least, shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in district ballots the person voted for as vice president.
I now yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
And they shall make distinct lists of all persons voted for as president, and of all persons voted for as vice president, and of the number of votes for each, which lists they shall sign and certify, and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate.
I now yield to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Stutzman.
The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes for President shall be the President. If such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if no person have such majority, then from the persons having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as President.
Now yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price.
The House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the President. But in choosing the President, the votes shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states, and a majority of all the states shall be necessary to a choice.
I now yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Sutherland.
The person having the greatest number of votes as Vice President shall be the Vice President, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if no person have a majority, then from the two highest numbers of the list the Senate shall choose the Vice President.
I now yield to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu.
A quorum for the purpose shall consist of 2/3 of the whole number of senators, and a majority of the whole number shall be necessary to a choice, but no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of President shall be eligible to that of Vice President of the United States.
I now yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Lewis.
Amendment 13, Section 1. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
I now yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Ridgell.
All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States.
I now yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Watt.
Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
I now yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Section 2. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for President and Vice President of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, or the members of the legislature thereof is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state.
I now yield to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Clark.
Section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president or vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature.
I now yield to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Elmers.
Or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support to the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may by a vote of 2/3 of each House remove such disability.
I now yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Israel.
Section 4, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of the insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void.
The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Section 5. The Congress should have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Amendment 15, Section 1. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
I now yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop.
Section 2. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Amendment 16. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration.
I now yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson.
Amendment 17. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years. Each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures.
Now yield to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Larson.
When vacancies happen in the representation of any state in the Senate, the executive authority of such state shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies, provided that the legislature of any state may empower the executive thereof to make temporary appointments until the people fill the vacancies by election as the legislature may direct.
I now yield to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Burkle.
Amendment 19, passed by Congress June 4th, 1919, ratified August 18th, 1920.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
I now yield to the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Schwartz.
The terms of the President and the Vice President shall end at noon on the 20th day of January, and the terms of Senators and Representatives at noon on the 3rd day of January of the years in which such terms would have ended if this article had not been ratified, and the terms of their successors shall then begin.
Now yield to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Section 2. The Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and such meeting shall begin at noon on the 3rd day of January, unless they shall by law appoint a different day. Section 3. If at the time fixed for the beginning of the term of the President-elect shall have died, the Vice President-elect shall become President.
Now yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
If a president shall not have been chosen before the time fixed for the beginning of his term, or if the president-elect shall have failed to qualify, then the vice president-elect shall act as president until the president shall have qualified. And the Congress may by law provide for the case written wherein neither a president-elect nor a vice president shall have qualified, declaring who shall then act as president, or the manner in which one who is to act shall be selected. And such person shall act accordingly until a president or a vice president shall have been qualified.
I now yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt.
Section 4. The Congress may, by law, provide for the case of the death of any of the persons from whom the House of Representatives may choose a president, whenever the right of choice shall have devolved upon them, and for the case of the death of any of the persons from whom the Senate may choose a vice president, whenever the right of choice shall have devolved upon them.
I now yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Serrano.
Section 5. Sections 1 and 2 shall take effect on the 15th day of October following the ratification of this article. Section 6. This article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states within 7 years from the date of its submission.
I now yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Platts.
Amendment 21, passed by Congress February 20th, 1933, ratified December 5th, 1933. Section 1, the 18th article of amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. Section 2, the transportation or importation into any state, territory, or possession of the United States for delivery or use therein of intoxicating liquors in violation of the laws thereof is hereby prohibited.
I now yield to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Schrader.
Section 3. This article should be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by conventions in the several states, as provided in the Constitution within 7 years from the date of submission hereof to the states by the Congress.
I now yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Meehan.
The 22nd Amendment, passed by Congress on March 21st, 1947. Section 1. No person shall be elected to the office of the President more than twice, and no person who has held the office of President or acted as President for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected President shall be elected to the office of President more than once.
I now yield to the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Nunnally.
But this article shall not apply to any person holding the office of President when this article was proposed by Congress, and shall not prevent any person who may be holding the office of President or acting as President during the term within which this article becomes operative from holding the office of President or acting as President during the remainder of such term.
Now yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller.
But this article shall not apply to any person holding the office of President when this article was proposed by the Congress, and shall not prevent any person who may be holding the office of President or acting as President during the term within which the article becomes operative from holding the office of President or acting as President during the remainder of such term.
Now yield to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Fleming.
Section 2. This article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states within 7 years from the date of its submission to the states by the Congress.
And now yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Amendment 23, passed by Congress June 16, 1960, ratified March 29, 1961. Section 1. The district constituting the seat of government of the United States shall appoint in such manner as Congress may direct a number of electors of President and Vice President equal to the whole number of senators and representatives in Congress to which the district would be entitled if it were a state.
I now yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
But in no event more than the least populous state. They shall be in addition to those appointed by the states, but they shall be considered, for the purposes of the election of President and Vice President, to be electors appointed by a state, and they shall meet in the district and perform such duties as provided by the 12th Article of Amendment. Section 2. The Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
I now yield to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Amendment 24, passed by Congress August 27, 1962, ratified January 23, 1964. Section 1. The right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for President or Vice President, for electors for President or Vice President, or for Senator or Representative in Congress shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by the reason of failure to pay poll tax or other tax. Section 2. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
Now yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Dent.
Amendment 25, passed by Congress July 6, 1965. Section 1, in case of the removal of the President from office or his death or resignation, the Vice President shall become President. Section 2, whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the Vice President, the President shall nominate a Vice President who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress.
Now yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford.
Whenever the President transmits to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of the Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the Vice President as acting President.
Now yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy. Section 4. Whenever the Vice President and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting President. Now yield to the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler.
Thereafter, when the President transmits to the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that no inability exists, he shall resume the powers and duties of his office unless the Vice President and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive department or of such other body as Congress may by law provide.
I now yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Transmit within 4 days to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Thereupon, Congress shall decide the issue, assembling within 48 hours for that purpose, if not in session.
I now yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Gibson.
If the Congress, within 21 days after receipt of the latter written declaration, or if Congress is not in session within 21 days after Congress is required to assemble, determines by 2/3 vote or both houses that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall continue to discharge the same as acting President. Otherwise, the President shall resume the powers and duties of his office.
I now yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Hultgren.
Amendment 26, passed by Congress March 23, 1971, ratified July 1, 1971. Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
I now yield to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fincher, who will read the last section of the Constitution, of the amendments.
Amendment 27,
originally proposed September 25th, 1789, ratified May 7th, 1992. No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened.
Mr. Speaker, with apology to those few members who were waiting to read, we have now completed the first reading aloud of the United States Constitution, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and adopt House Resolution 22.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 22, resolution reducing the amount authorized for salaries and expenses of member, committee, and leadership offices in 2011 and 2012.
Pursuant to Clause 11 of Rule 10 and Clause 11 of Rule 1, and the order of the House of January 5, 2011, the Chair announces the Speaker's appointment of the following members of the House to the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Rogers, Michigan, Chairman. Pursuant to Section 5B of House Resolution 5, the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Brady, each will control 1 hour. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I ask that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today is a momentous day. We're all here together as new members of Congress and, more importantly, at the cusp of a new era in America's political life. I find it humbling and most appropriate that while yesterday we were ceremonially sworn in this historic House chamber and appropriately voted on a transparency-enhancing rules package, today we began our proceedings with a reading of the United States Constitution. The Constitution not only establishes our polity and our framework of government, it enshrines as our fundamental law the proper role of government. Mr. Speaker, as we promised in our pledge to America, today's reading was an affirmation of our commitment to return this government back to its proper role, a smaller, less costly, more accountable one. Mr. Speaker, the resolution before us, introduced by my colleague from Oregon, is extremely important to today's affirmation. And it is no accident that this is our first piece of legislative business in this, the 112th Congress. This legislation is significant because, along with our other activities here on the House floor this week, this bill, committing ourselves to a more responsible and efficient stewardship of the taxpayers' dollars, demonstrates, we hope, to the American people that we are listening. Mr. Speaker, the People's House should act first and lead by example. Everybody knows that across this country, families and small businesses have cut their spending, are paying off their debt, and are striving to live within their means. We should do the same, and this legislation is a beginning. It will do that by having an immediate impact, and we'd like to thank the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, and his transition team for their hard work and their constructive ideas. Under this resolution, each leadership, committee, and member office in the 112th Congress will receive no more than 95% of its 111th Congress funding level. In fiscal year 2011, this will mean a savings of $1 million from leadership office, savings of $8.1 million from committee budgets, and a savings of $26.1 million from, collectively, the members' office budgets. For those who may not know, the members' office budgets are the specific amounts that are given to members so that they can carry out their functions as members of Congress. It includes the ability to communicate with their constituents. It includes paying for their staff. It includes paying for the transportation from their district to Washington, D.C. and back. It includes the rental on their district offices. In other words, it is the money that is utilized for members to carry out their official activities. These are important jobs that members are required to do if, in fact, we are to represent our people appropriately. Nonetheless, even though these are important things that we do, we should try to be even more efficient in the way that we do them. That is the purpose of this legislation before us. Mr. Speaker, these are substantial cuts in budgets that, frankly, cannot continue indefinitely on an upward trajectory. We must all find ways to do more with less to enhance our productivity and to ferret out waste and inefficiencies wherever they may be. With that being said, this initial savings is only a down payment on future efforts. My colleagues and I on House Administration are dedicated to continuing savings and reductions in spending in other areas as well. Thus, for fiscal year 2012, we've committed to keeping this 5% reduction in place. We're also directing all House officers, such as the clerk, the sergeant-at-arms, and the chief administrative officer, to find savings within their own organizations without sacrificing their services and the excellence they pride themselves on maintaining. In other words, to do what all Americans are attempting in their own lives, finding ways to do more with less. We look forward to hearing from these and other House offices in specificity as to what their cost-saving plans will be. As has been said by our Speaker, we've committed to cutting domestic spending and returning non-security discretionary spending to 2008 levels. If we could live on that level of spending a mere 2 years ago, surely we can find ways to do so again. Again, American families are doing it, American businesses are doing it, we must try as well. Mr. Speaker, listening to the American people and restoring the proper role of government means decreasing spending, ending our deficit mentality, and fostering job creation. These are the virtues that have made this country great and will sustain us in the future. I want to publicly thank my colleague, Mr. Walden, and his transition team for the efforts that they put into this legislation, and I would urge all of my colleagues to support it. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves, gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself at such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as a staunch advocate for strong, accountable stewardship of hard-earned taxpayers' dollars, I applaud any effort to responsibly address this concern. I travel back and forth to my district every day in the city of Philadelphia, and I spend a large portion of every day listening to constituents as they voice their concerns over our economy and real impact that it has on their day-to-day lives. Certainly, this House must take steps to ensure the resources are effectively utilized, administrated, and accounted for. To that end, I support this resolution and encourage my colleagues to do so as well. During the 111 Congress, significant steps were taken by the House leadership to expand transparency and responsible use of taxpayers' dollars. At the direction of Speaker Pelosi, the Committee on House Administration under my chairmanship worked with the Office of the CAO to introduce the House Statement of Disbursements in an online electronic format. For the first time, constituents, the media, and other concerned individuals could review every penny spent by members, committees, and leadership offices. Through the Green the Capitol initiative and with the cooperation of the architect of the Capitol, we rolled out enhancements designed to increase the energy efficiency of the Capitol complex, resulting in cost savings. Under the Democrat majority, we put in place requirements that only vehicles meeting lower greenhouse emission standards were eligible for MRA fund lease payments. Not only does this have positive environmental impact, it also reduces fuel costs since these vehicles are generally more fuel efficient. The cost savings that were introduced were done so responsibility with the consenting eye on ensuring that members have the resources they need also to be able to serve their constituency. This is ultimately the reason why we are here. I look forward to exploring additional responsible cost-saving opportunities with Chairman Lundgren in the spirit of bipartisanship cooperation that we have enjoyed for many years. And I also urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this resolution. And, Mr. Speaker, at this time, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, who spent enormous amount of time beginning immediately after the elections to bring us to this point.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the chairman of the Administration Committee for his help and assistance as we work through the transition. I also want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Brady, and Mr. Andrews as well, who were designated by then Speaker Pelosi to be a formal conduit for us on the transition. They were most helpful and gave us good insights. And I want to thank all the members who participated and the staff whom we reached out to in a survey across this campus to say, how can we do this better? How can we be more efficient with our time and the taxpayers' money, and where can we cut costs? Today's that first installment. There's an old saying that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a single step forward, but it is a $35 million first step. We think we can at least save that in this effort today, and leadership really starts at the top. American people have spoken loudly and clearly. They're very concerned about the economy and their jobs and their communities, and they're equally and deeply concerned about the deficits that have been racked up by both parties over time. We have to turn that around, or we end up looking like some of these countries elsewhere around the globe that are facing financial ruin if they don't change. We have to change too, and we're asking ourselves to take the first step here and save at least $35 million. As Mr. Brady has pointed out and Mr. Lundgren's pointed out, this is a first installment. Our management team in this organization is looking at each department on how they can achieve additional savings. As you know, we have an Inspector General that looks at everything on Capitol Hill and identifies ways we can improve safety and security and cut costs and be more efficient. And so we are letting them do their management piece. Now, I was a small business owner for 22 years with my wife out in Oregon. I understand that if you don't watch the pennies and the nickels, you'll never get to the dollars. You have to look at everything you do in real time to try and squeeze out efficiency, and I think we've done that. As Republicans, our pledge to America was to do exactly that across the government. And you will see oversight hearings about policy, oversight hearings about job-killing regulations, because we want to get America working again. And I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle share that view, that it is the private sector jobs that we have to get restored in this country. We have to grow the economy and create jobs and put Washington's fiscal house back in order, and we'll take the first steps today with this legislation and this resolution. So specifically, we believe $35 million out of our own budgets. It's a 5% reduction, except I should point out the Appropriations Committee will actually suffer a 9% reduction. And they came forward with that level. And I applaud them for that. This is firm but flexible. Members will still determine within their budgets how they're spent. We don't micromanage here. We treat you as adults, and we're going to treat government agencies as adults, but we will expect results, because the American people spoke clearly in November and said we want transparency, we want openness, we want accountability, we want you to cut deficit spending, and we want you to create private sector jobs. So, Mr. Chairman, I think we have begun that process today. I thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for supporting us in this bipartisan effort, and with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Yes, I'd also like to thank Mr. Waldron for allowing me to participate, myself and Mr. Andrews from New Jersey, for allowing us to participate. And I certainly do not want to get you in any kind of trouble here today, but we did have some ideas that happened to fall into and come into the implication of your plan. I know that was just great minds thinking alike. It wasn't that it was our idea that did that. But I'm talking especially toward the schedule. I do appreciate that, and I do appreciate you allowing us to participate in what you've done there, and to look forward again to working with you in the future. And I reserve the balance of my time. Thank you.
I thank you, gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Kentucky, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Rogers.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, this is a historic time for this Congress, this House, my committee. I can say without a moment's hesitation that this day represents a crucial turning point for our nation as this new Congress begins a path to fiscal sanity. With this resolution today, Congress will begin immediately to reduce spending, starting here and now, with our own office budgets and our committee budgets and the like. To demonstrate my strong commitment to slashing spending, reducing our national deficit, and getting our economy back on track, I've directed my own committee budget to be cut not by 5%, Mr. Speaker, but by 9%, nearly double the amount of reductions proposed for other House offices. What the Appropriations Committee is saying to all other committees: we see your 5, we raise you 4. And so we're cutting 9%. This year, the Appropriations Committee will be ground zero for a wide range of reductions across the federal government, and by cutting our own budget first, Mr. Speaker, we are showing we're willing to lead by example. This is a critical time for the Appropriations Committee, as we will carry out the most expansive reduction of discretionary spending in the history of this country. Under my watch, the Appropriations Committee will be an instrument of change to enforce the will of the American people. My Republican colleagues on the committee and I are ready to stand and fight for the American people and show that we're serious about our commitment to rein in government spending and control our exploding deficits. Yet it's important to remember that slashing spending to save taxpayer dollars and reducing the size of government is a means to an end. We must always keep our eyes on the ultimate goal: improving our economy, getting our people back to work, and safeguarding the nation's financial security for the future. The one and only mandate that we received from the American people in November, in my judgment, was to put our economy and jobs first. This is why people came to the polls and voted for a change in this body. And this is the duty that we must fulfill. To this end, it's clear that this Congress cannot let favored yet troublesome programs slip by or allow turf battles to cloud our shared interest in protecting the taxpayer. Our budget axe will swing wide and true, and no area of the federal government will be immune from our scrutiny and cuts. Sacred cows are, for all intents and purposes, extinct. Mr. Speaker, we have a big job ahead of us. While this resolution is a small step forward, it is a giant leap to show in a very personal and practical way the commitment we have to reducing spending and getting our economy back on track. The first drawn blood is ours.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Continues to reserve. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, this time I'd yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Crenshaw.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 4 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding the time, and I rise in strong support of this resolution. What does it do? You've heard, quite simply, it saves American taxpayers millions of dollars. How does it do it? Quite simply, it says we're going to spend less money in this House. These are difficult times, and we can't just keep on doing things like we've always done them. We've got to change things. No more perks, no more privileges, no more waste. We have a chance with this resolution to, as a House, look at ourselves in the mirror and say we're going to lead by example. American people have been making these tough choices all along. I think it's time that this House put its own house in order. But we have to remember that actions speak louder than words. Difficult times mean leaders have to lead. We have a chance to take a bold step to say that we're going to try to stop this culture of spending that we've all gotten used to and say, let's start a culture of savings. Now, that's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. It's going to be painful. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be tough. But we must do it. And that's where we begin to start. That's what this resolution does. It says that we're going to take the first step. We're going to cut our own spending. We're going to do more with less. And I think right now we can do a whole lot more with a whole lot less. I know that, you know that, and I think the American people know that. But we all know that we need money to provide services. But right now it seems to me that government needs something more. We need discipline to rein in spending. We need courage to make the right decisions even when they're hard. And we need to seize the challenge to provide services in these difficult times. We got to make sure that every task of government is accomplished more efficiently and more effectively than it ever has been before. Because if life is going to change in America, life has to change here in Washington. And this is the first step. So I urge the adoption of this resolution. Reel back my time.
Gentleman from California.
At this time, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Alabama, member of the transition team, the gentlelady, Congresswoman.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, our nation is on an unsustainable path. Over the last 2 years, all we have seen from Washington is more spending, more borrowing, and more debt. The American taxpayer has been burdened with $3 trillion worth of bailouts and buyouts. Never before has a government spent so much while the people received so little. One of the goals of the transition team was to restore fiscal responsibility back to Congress. And I would like to thank the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, for his leadership on that transition team. Working families all across America have been forced to tighten their belts during this economic downturn. The Congress should be no different. Our proposal would cut members' representational allowances by 5%. It will save the American taxpayer at least $35 million annually over the next year. No one is suggesting that this is a silver bullet. In fact, it is far from it. Reducing our soaring debt will require this Congress to deeply commit to the tough choices that will be required to put our nation back on track. But in many ways, our budget woes began in this chamber, and so too should they end. This resolution is a symbolic start to this process. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from California.
At this time, Mr. Speaker, I would yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Scott.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, on the campaign trail for the last several months, we've heard two things from people. We've heard cut spending, cut spending, cut spending, and the other thing we heard consistently was live by the decisions that you make in Congress. Well, today we have a great opportunity before us. We have an opportunity to do both, to start cutting spending, $35 million plus in spending cuts, starting with us. It means that we start first and foremost by living with the decisions that we make. A 5% deduction in our MRAs gives us an opportunity to not spend the money so that other folks and families, small businesses have an opportunity when not paying taxes to invest more money in the future of their country and their families. Second, as we consistently live under our own decisions, we tell the American people that we are simply listening. I heard constantly that the American people want a Congress that listens, that hears what they're saying, that understands their pain, and then does something about it. The first step in that direction is for us to start living within our own means and to tell the American people that we hear them. If we want to restore the confidence of the American people in their elected officials, we must start by doing things like this, cutting ourselves first and asking the rest of the government to follow.
Gentleman continues to reserve.
Reserve my time back.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it is my pleasure to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, a member of the transition team.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, the gentleman from California. And Mr. Speaker, today I am glad to support a resolution that puts away the knives of politics and instead pulls out the shears of budget cutting. Thank you to Representative Walden, Mr. Walden, for your work in the Transition Committee to again restore accountability and transparency by leading with example in one of the most historic institutions this world has ever witnessed. Throughout my time in the state legislature of Colorado, throughout the past several months, I've talked to constituents around the 4th Congressional District of Colorado about the need to lead by example, the need to start in our own backyard first, to cut our budgets, to make sure that we are leading by example. Just a couple of rows from here on this chamber, when we took the oath of office, my 7-year-old daughter accompanied me to witness a transition of power. But that means nothing if we cannot lead by example, and I will have failed her as a 7-year-old child and every child like her if we do not lead by example, and we start today by cutting our own budgets. The 5% cut to our budget, it's not massive, but it is monumental. And it's something that we must all take seriously, our efforts to begin leading the American people. Around this country, citizens of the United States are looking to Congress for signs of hope that we have learned a lesson that this Congress has spent too much, grown too much, and that we will put our own house in order. Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to talk today and the honor of standing in support of a resolution that says to the American people, we will indeed lead by example. We will begin in our house first.
Gentleman reserves. The House will hear a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to S-Conres 2, authorizing the use of the rotunda of the Capitol for an event marking the 50th anniversary of the inaugural address of President John F. Kennedy, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
Thank you. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it gives me a great deal of pleasure to yield the 1 minute to the Majority Leader of the House of Representatives, the distinguished gentleman from Virginia,
Majority
Mr.
Leader
Kennedy.
is recognized.
Thank the gentleman from California. Mr. Speaker, our new majority will be a results-driven Congress with one clear goal: to create jobs and generate economic growth. Our defining principle will be cut and grow. Cut spending and job-killing regulations and grow jobs in the economy. Our mission is urgent. For the economy to grow, families, businesses, and financial markets need to know that we are serious about cutting spending. If we don't act, the threat of future tax increases, inflation, and higher borrowing costs will continue to serve as an anchor on the economy. Beginning the new Republican majority by cutting our own congressional operating budgets sends the right message. The days of families and small businesses tightening their belt while the federal government goes on a spending spree are over. This self-imposed 5% cut to our own House operating budgets will save American taxpayers more than $35 million immediately. I hope that federal agencies across the spectrum will follow suit and find ways to cut their own budgets. This legislation is a small but significant step toward promoting a culture of opportunity, responsibility, and success. And I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, this time I would like to yield to another gentleman who served us well on the transition team, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, 3 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of House Resolution 22. In fact, it's an this issue. When I went around in the campaign, I heard from the people of the 11th District of Illinois repeatedly a number of things. But on the forefront of it was cut spending. We have a massive deficit. We've lived the last few years acting like we can just spend money and never worry about it. Well, we saw a massive change in the last few months ago, and it's time for us to heed that message. And how better to do it than to lead by example? As well as hearing about we need to cut spending, I heard about humility a lot, and a majority that needs to lead with a sense of humbleness. And I think this is key. Lead by example. But we need to wrestle the beast of spending. I don't have kids yet, but someday I will. And when I do, I don't want to live with the responsibility that I continue to shovel debt and debt on top of them and make them have to handle that now. As a member of the military, I also understand, and I've been doing that for 8 years, I understand what sacrifice is, and I understand that folks have been fighting on the outside for defense of our country. And it's time for us now to fight on the inside for the defense of our country. $35 million isn't going to solve all of our budget problems, but it's a good first step. This is a first step in a probably very painful process where we have to understand and wrestle with this beast and where everybody is going to have to sacrifice. But it's the first step and a very necessary step to ensure that we're leaving our children a union and a country far better than one we inherited. So to the people of the 11th District of Illinois, to the people of America, let me say the freshman class and the Republican majority has heard your voice. We heard what you said on November 2nd, and we're going to seriously cut spending, and we're going to start with our own budget. We're proud to do it, and we're going to step forward and lead and make you proud. Thank you so much for the opportunity to address on this issue, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.